The moving truck pulled away from the modest two-story house on Maple Street, leaving behind 30 years of memories and a lifetime of regret. Margaret Wilson stood on the porch steps, her weathered hands clutching a foreclosure notice, tears streaming down her cheeks. Behind her, Robert Wilson loaded their final box into their beat-up sedan, his shoulders heavy with defeat. That's when the black BMW pulled up. A tall, well-dressed black man stepped out, his suit expensive, his presence commanding. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as recognition dawned. The same bright eyes, the same gentle smile she remembered from 25 years ago. "Hello, Mrs. Wilson," he said, his voice calm but carrying weight. "I believe we need to talk." Robert turned around, and the box slipped from his hands, crashing to the ground. "Marcus?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Marcus Johnson?" The young man they had fostered for 3 years, then forgotten when their lives got complicated, now stood before them holding the deed to their house. But this wasn't about revenge. This was about something far more powerful, something that would reshape everything they thought they knew about love, family, and second chances. How did a forgotten foster child become the very person who would save the family that abandoned him? How did rejection transform into redemption? And what does it truly mean to come home? Thank you so much for clicking on this video. I know your time is precious, and I'm honored that you've chosen to spend it here with me. This story is going to take you on an emotional journey that I promise will stay with you long after it ends. If you're finding value in this content, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, and I'd love to know where you're watching from today. So drop a comment below and tell me your city or country. Your engagement means the world to me and helps these important stories reach more people who need to hear them. Now let's dive into this incredible story of abandonment, perseverance, and the most unexpected kind of love. Margaret and Robert Wilson were good people. That's what everyone in Cedarville said about them. They ran the local hardware store that Robert's father had opened in 1952, attended St. Mary's Episcopal Church every Sunday, and had been trying to start a family for nearly a decade. Margaret was 34, Robert 36, and after years of failed fertility treatments, they had finally found peace with the idea that their family would look different than they'd originally imagined. It was Margaret's sister Linda who first suggested foster care. "You two have so much love to give," she'd said over Sunday dinner in the spring of 1998. "There are children out there who need exactly what you can offer." The idea terrified and thrilled them in equal measure. They spent months completing paperwork, attending training sessions, and transforming their spare bedroom into a cheerful child's room. Margaret painted the walls a soft yellow, neither too masculine nor too feminine, and Robert built a bookshelf that he filled with classics like Where the Wild Things Are and The Giving Tree. The call came on a rainy Tuesday morning in October. Sarah Chen from the Department of Children's Services spoke in gentle, measured tones. "We have a 7-year-old boy named Marcus Johnson. His mother passed away from cancer 3 weeks ago, and there are no known relatives. He's been staying with a temporary family, but he needs a more permanent placement while we work on long-term solutions." Margaret's hand trembled as she held the phone. "Tell us about him." "He's a bright kid, reads above grade level, loves to draw. He's been through a lot, but he's remarkably resilient. The thing is," Sarah paused, "Marcus is African American. I want to make sure you and Robert are prepared for the challenges that might bring, especially in a community like Cedarville." Cedarville was 93% white. The Wilsons' church had exactly 2 black families among its 200 members. But as Margaret looked at the yellow room they'd prepared with such hope, none of that seemed to matter. "When can we meet him?" she asked. 3 days later, Marcus Johnson walked into their lives carrying everything he owned in a small duffel bag. He was smaller than Margaret had expected, with serious dark eyes and a cautious smile. He wore a Superman t-shirt that was too big for him, and sneakers with holes in the soles. "This is your room," Margaret said, opening the door to the yellow bedroom. Marcus stepped inside slowly, running his fingers along the bookshelf Robert had built. "These are all for me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every single one," Robert said, kneeling down to Marcus's eye level. "And if you want different books, we can go to the library and pick out whatever you like." For the first time since they'd met him, Marcus smiled widely, and Margaret felt her heart expand in a way she'd never experienced before. This was their son. Not biologically, not legally yet, but in every way that mattered. The first 3 years with Marcus were the happiest of Margaret and Robert's marriage. The boy who had arrived so cautious and quiet transformed into a vibrant, curious child who who filled their home with laughter and light. Marcus excelled in school, consistently earning A's and praise from his teachers. He had a particular gift for mathematics and art, often spending hours at the kitchen table creating elaborate drawings while Margaret cooked dinner. His favorite subjects were space and dinosaurs. Robert delighted in building model rockets with him in the garage. "Look, Dad," Marcus would say, his face glowing with excitement as their latest creation soared into the sky. He'd started calling Robert Dad about 6 months after moving in, and it never failed to make Robert's chest swell with pride. The community embraced Marcus too. Mostly, there were a few uncomfortable moments, whispered conversations that stopped when Margaret entered the grocery store, pointed stares at church, but Marcus's teachers loved him. His classmates invited him to birthday parties, and slowly, the Wilsons found their rhythm as a family. Margaret documented everything, photo albums filled with pictures of Marcus's first day of 3rd grade, his school art show where his painting of a family of 3 won 2nd place, family vacations to the lake where Marcus learned to fish and swim. She kept every report card, every drawing he made, every small token of their life together. "He's not technically ours yet," she would tell her sister Linda, "but he feels like ours. More than that, he feels like he was always meant to be ours." The adoption paperwork sat on Robert's desk, half completed. They meant to finish it. They really did, but life kept getting in the way. The hardware store needed attention. There were always bills to pay, appointments to make. Marcus seemed settled and happy, and the social workers visited less frequently. It felt like they had all the time in the world. But then Margaret got pregnant. She found out on a Thursday morning in March 2002, staring at the pink lines on a pregnancy test in the bathroom of their small house. After 12 years of trying countless doctor's appointments and finally accepting that biological children weren't in their future, she was pregnant at 38. When she told Robert, he cried. When they told Marcus, he threw his arms around Margaret's waist and whispered, "I'm going to be the best big brother ever." For a few months, it felt like their family was simply expanding, growing more complete. Marcus helped Margaret pick out baby clothes, insisted on reading to her belly every night, and drew pictures of himself holding his new sibling. But something subtle began to shift. Friends and extended family, who had been supportive but somewhat distant about Marcus, were suddenly overwhelmingly excited. "Your own baby," Margaret's mother gushed over the phone. Finally, a real Wilson heir. The words stung, even though Margaret knew her mother didn't mean them cruelly, but she noticed Robert's parents, who had been kind but reserved with Marcus, were now talking about college funds and family heirlooms, traditions they'd never mentioned when it was just Marcus. Little Emma Wilson was born on November 15, 2002, a perfect, healthy baby girl with Robert's blue eyes and Margaret's stubborn chin. Margaret fell in love instantly and completely the same way she had with Marcus, but this love felt different somehow. Primal, fierce, all-consuming. She told herself it was just biology, just hormones, just the exhaustion of caring for a newborn. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed in their family dynamic. Marcus, now 10 years old, was everything he'd promised to be as a big brother. He helped with diaper changes, sang lullabies when Emma cried, and proudly told everyone at school about his baby sister. But Margaret noticed things she wished she hadn't. The way Robert's face lit up differently when he looked at Emma, the way their conversations increasingly centered around their biological daughter's milestones and future. The adoption paperwork remained unfinished. The call came on a Tuesday morning in January 2005, when Marcus was 12 and Emma was 2. Margaret was in the kitchen making breakfast, Emma on her hip. When the phone rang, it was Sarah Chen from the Department of Children's Services, her voice professional but tinged with concern. "Mrs. Wilson, I need to schedule a home visit. It's been over a year since our last check-in, and we need to discuss Marcus's permanent placement status." Margaret's stomach dropped. In the chaos of new parenthood, late nights, and managing a toddler, the reality of Marcus's legal status had faded into the background. He felt like their son. He called them Mom and Dad. He'd been with them for over 6 years. Surely the paperwork was just a formality at this point. "Of course," Margaret managed. "When would be convenient? How about Thursday afternoon? And Mrs. Wilson, it would be helpful if you and Robert could have those adoption papers ready for review. The ones we discussed several years ago." After hanging up, Margaret stood in her kitchen, Emma babbling happily in her arms, and felt a cold dread settle in her chest. The adoption papers weren't ready. They weren't even close to ready. Somewhere in the daily routine of life, they had let the most important things slip through the cracks. When Robert came home that evening, she told him about the call. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture she recognized as his stress response. "How did we let this happen?" he asked. "We meant to finish those papers." "I know, but with Emma, and the store and everything." Margaret's voice trailed off. The excuses sounded hollow even to her own ears. "We'll figure it out," Robert said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We'll explain to Sarah that we want to proceed with the adoption. It'll just take a little longer." But that night, lying in bed with Emma sleeping between them, they had the conversation that changed everything. "Rob," Margaret whispered in the darkness, what if this is a sign?" "What do you mean?" What if the universe is telling us something? We have Emma now, our biological daughter, and the store is struggling. Money's tight. College for 2 kids instead of 1. Maybe. She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the terrible thought that had been growing in her mind for months. Robert was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "You're thinking maybe Marcus would be better off with a family who can focus completely on him. A family where he's not competing with a biological child for attention." "I'm not saying we don't love him," Margaret said quickly. "We do, but maybe love isn't enough. Maybe he deserves to be someone's first choice, not their consolation prize." They told themselves they were being noble, selfless, that this decision was about Marcus's best interests, not their own convenience or their secret relief at simplifying their lives. They convinced themselves that a younger couple, a couple without other children, could give Marcus opportunities they couldn't. When Sarah Chen arrived Thursday afternoon, they had rehearsed their speech. Marcus was at school, Emma napping upstairs. They sat in their living room, surrounded by 6 years of family photos that included Marcus in every frame and destroyed their family with good intentions. "We've been thinking," Margaret began, her voice steady despite the way her hands shook, "about Marcus's future, and we think he might be happier with a family that can focus entirely on him." Sarah's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. "I see, and this decision has nothing to do with Emma's arrival." "Of course not," Robert said quickly. "This is about what's best for Marcus. He's such a special kid. He deserves parents who can give him everything. We thought we could, but with the business struggling and Emma to think about..." Sarah made notes on her clipboard, her pen scratching against the paper. "I'll need to make arrangements to move Marcus to a new placement. These transitions work best when they happen quickly. Minimize the trauma for the child." "How quickly?" Margaret asked. "I can have someone here Friday afternoon to pick him up. That gives you tonight and tomorrow morning to help him pack and say goodbye." 48 hours. After 6 years, they were giving him 48 hours notice that his entire world was ending. That evening they sat Marcus down at the kitchen table where he'd done homework, eaten countless meals, and drawn hundreds of pictures. Emma played with blocks on the floor, oblivious to the devastation about to unfold. "Marcus," Margaret began, then stopped. "How do you tell a child that he's no longer wanted? How do you destroy someone's sense of security and belonging with kind words and gentle explanations?" "We need to talk to you about something important," Robert continued, "about your future and what's best for you." Marcus looked between them, his 12-year-old face serious and attentive. "Okay. You know how much we love you," Margaret said, "how much joy you've brought to our lives. But sometimes, loving someone means making hard decisions." They explained it as gently as they could. New opportunities, a chance for a fresh start, a family who could give him their complete attention. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression growing more and more distant. "When?" he asked finally. "Friday afternoon," Robert said. "I know it seems fast, but the social workers think quick transitions are easier." Marcus nodded slowly. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart," Margaret said. "Is it because of Emma? Because she's really yours and I'm not?" The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Margaret and Robert exchanged glances, and in that moment, Marcus saw the truth they couldn't speak aloud. "Oh," he said quietly, "I understand." He stood up from the table, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. "I'll go pack my things." That was the last real conversation they ever had. Friday afternoon came too soon and not soon enough. Marcus had spent Thursday night lying in his bed, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars. Robert had helped him stick to the ceiling 3 years earlier, trying to memorize every detail of the only home he'd ever really known. He packed his belongings methodically. The duffel bag he'd arrived with 6 years ago was too small now, so Margaret had given him 2 suitcases. His clothes filled one suitcase easily, the other was for his treasures, the model rockets he and Robert had built, his art supplies, the photo albums Margaret had made for him, books they'd read together. At the bottom of his closet, he found the adoption papers, the ones that were supposed to make him a Wilson forever. They were incomplete, barely started, with only the most basic information filled in. The date on the top of the forms was from 2003. 2 years earlier, they'd had 2 years to complete them, and they'd never even tried. When Sarah Chen arrived, Margaret cried. She hugged Marcus tightly and whispered, "This doesn't mean we don't love you. This will always be your home." But Marcus was 12 years old, and he understood that love wasn't enough if it didn't make you fight for someone. Love wasn't enough if it could be set aside when something better came along. Robert shook his hand like he was a business associate, not the boy who had called him dad for 5 years. "You're going to do great things, son," he said. "I know it." As Sarah's car pulled away from Maple Street, Marcus turned around for one last look at the house. Margaret stood in the doorway, holding Emma, Robert's hand on her shoulder. They looked like the perfect family portrait, and Marcus finally understood that there had never been room for him in that picture. His new placement was with the Hendersons, a kind older couple who had been fostering children for 20 years. They had experience with kids who came from disrupted placements, who arrived angry and hurt, and convinced that every adult would eventually disappoint them. Mrs. Henderson was patient when Marcus barely spoke for the first month. Mr. Henderson didn't push when Marcus refused to participate in family activities. They gave him space to grieve the loss of the only family he'd ever known, even though the Wilsons were still alive, still living 30 minutes away in the same small town. But 12-year-old Marcus made himself a promise in that first week with the Hendersons. He would never again depend on someone else's love to determine his worth. He would never again allow himself to be disposable. School became his refuge. While other kids played at recess, Marcus buried himself in books. While his classmates worried about social dynamics and friendships, Marcus focused on grades, on being the smartest kid in every class, on building a future that no one could take away from him. The Hendersons tried to adopt him, but Marcus asked them not to. He'd learned that legal papers didn't make families real, and he didn't want to risk the disappointment again. Better to know where he stood. He saw the Wilsons around town occasionally. Cedarville was small enough that avoiding them completely was impossible. At the grocery store, at the gas station, at high school football games, Margaret would always look stricken when she spotted him, her face crumpling with guilt and grief. Robert would nod politely, like Marcus was a neighbor's kid, he vaguely remembered. Emma grew from a toddler to a little girl, and Marcus watched from a distance as she experienced all the things he'd once taken for granted: family vacations, birthday parties with extended relatives, the security of belonging somewhere permanently. The hardest part wasn't the anger. Marcus had expected to be angry, and he was, a burning fury that fueled his determination to succeed. The hardest part was the love that remained. Despite everything, despite the abandonment and the broken promises, he still loved them. He loved Robert's patient way of explaining things, Margaret's warm hugs, even little Emma's bright laugh. That love made him feel weak and stupid, so he buried it deep and focused on the future he was building for himself. High school brought new challenges and new opportunities. Marcus's grades were exceptional, but college seemed impossible for a foster kid with no financial support. That's when Mrs. Henderson sat him down for a conversation that changed his trajectory. "You're special, Marcus," she said, "not because of what happened to you, but because of how you've chosen to respond to it. You have options, but you need to start believing you deserve them." She helped him apply for scholarships, write essays, navigate the complex world of financial aid. Marcus poured his story onto those application pages, writing about foster care and abandonment, and the determination to create a different life. He wrote about the family that loved him until they didn't, and how that experience had taught him that the only person he could truly rely on was himself. The full scholarship to State University felt like vindication. As Marcus packed his belongings for college, Mrs. Henderson handed him a small wrapped package. "Don't open it now," she said. "Wait until you need a reminder of how far you've come." Marcus tucked the package into his suitcase, along with one photo from his time with the Wilsons. It showed the 4 of them at the lake during the summer before Emma was born. They looked happy, genuinely happy, like a real family. He kept it not because he missed that time, but because he needed to remember that happiness could be temporary, that love could be conditional, that he could never again let his guard down completely. College was where Marcus truly found himself. He studied business and finance with the same intensity he'd once applied to elementary school homework. He joined clubs, made friends, dated occasionally, but always kept part of himself protected, always maintained some emotional distance. His professors noticed his drive and intelligence. Internships led to job offers led to promotions led to opportunities he'd never imagined as a 12-year-old boy packing his life into suitcases. By 25, Marcus was a successful financial advisor with his own apartment, his own car, and a growing investment portfolio. By 30, he'd started his own firm. By 35, he was wealthy enough to buy and sell the hardware store that had once been Robert Wilson's pride and joy. But success didn't heal the wound. Success didn't answer the questions that still kept him awake at night. How do you let go of someone you've called your child for 6 years? How do you choose between love and convenience? How do you live with yourself after breaking a child's heart in the name of his own good? Marcus thought about the Wilsons often, wondered how they justified their decision, wondered if they ever regretted it. He'd heard through mutual acquaintances that the hardware store was struggling, that Robert's father had died and left them with debts they couldn't manage, that Emma was now in high school and applying to colleges they couldn't afford. He told himself he didn't care. He told himself he'd moved on, built a better life without them, proven that their abandonment had only made him stronger. But late at night, in his expensive apartment with its view of the city skyline, Marcus still sometimes looked at that photo from the lake and wondered what his life would have been like if the Wilsons had loved him enough to fight for him. The plan began forming in Marcus's mind on a Tuesday morning in March 2023, as he sat in his downtown office reviewing real estate investments. His assistant knocked and entered with a stack of documents requiring his signature. "It is an interesting property that just came on the market," she mentioned casually. "A house in Cedarville, about an hour north. The bank is foreclosing, and it's priced well below market value." Marcus looked up from his paperwork. He hadn't been to Cedarville in over a decade, hadn't thought about the Wilsons well, that was a lie. He thought about them all the time, but he'd stopped expecting closure, stopped hoping for apologies that would never come. "What's the address?" he asked, though part of him already knew. 12247 Maple Street. Apparently, the previous owners defaulted on their mortgage after some kind of business failure. 247 Maple Street. The house with the yellow bedroom that had once been his. The kitchen table where he'd done homework. The backyard where he'd learned to throw a baseball with Robert. The place he'd called home for 6 years, until he became inconvenient. That evening, Marcus drove to Cedarville for the first time since high school graduation. The town looked smaller than he remembered, shabbier around the edges. Main Street had several empty storefronts, and the Wilson hardware store was one of them. A for-lease sign hung crooked in the window, and Marcus could see boxes and debris scattered inside. He parked across from 225 in Maple Street and studied the house that held so many of his memories. The paint was peeling, the front porch sagged slightly, and the garden Margaret had once tended with such care was overgrown with weeds. A foreclosure notice was taped to the front door. As he sat in his car, Marcus watched an old sedan pull into the driveway. Robert Wilson stepped out first, moving slowly, his shoulders bent with more than age. He looked defeated, worn down by circumstances and choices. Margaret emerged from the passenger side, and Marcus's breath caught. She looked frail, older than her 64 years, her face etched with lines of worry and regret. They moved around their car with the careful precision of people who'd learned to make every dollar stretch, every decision count. Robert carried a single grocery bag. Margaret clutched a small purse close to her chest. These were not the people who had once owned a business, who had chosen their biological daughter's future over their foster son's heart. These were people who had lost everything that once made them feel secure and important. Marcus felt a complex mix of emotions: satisfaction that they were struggling, guilt for feeling satisfied, curiosity about how they'd ended up this way, and underneath it all, a stubborn thread of the love he'd never been able to completely eliminate. He drove home that night with a plan forming in his mind. It wasn't about revenge, not exactly. It was about completion, about closing a circle that had been left open for 21 years. It was about asking the questions he'd never had the courage to ask. and giving them the opportunity to provide answers he'd never expected to receive. The next morning, Marcus called his real estate agent and made an offer on 2047 Maple Street. He offered the full asking price, with a cash payment and a quick closing. The bank accepted immediately. But buying the house was just the first step. Marcus spent the following weeks researching what had happened to the Wilsons since he'd left their lives. The information wasn't hard to find in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Robert's father had died in 2018, leaving behind a hardware store that was already struggling to compete with big-box retailers. Robert had tried to modernize, had taken out loans to renovate and expand inventory, but the pandemic had devastated small businesses throughout the region. By 2022, the store was losing money every month, and they'd mortgaged their house to try to keep it afloat. Emma had graduated from high school with dreams of attending State University, the same school where Marcus had earned his degree, but without savings or the ability to qualify for substantial loans, she'd ended up at the local community college, living at home and working part-time at a diner to help with family expenses. Margaret's mother had developed dementia and required expensive care that insurance didn't fully cover. The medical bills, combined with the failing business and Emma's education costs, had created a perfect storm of financial disaster. Learning these details didn't bring Marcus the satisfaction he'd expected. Instead, he felt a complicated sadness for the family that had once been his, mixed with admiration for how they'd tried to protect Emma's future even as their own security crumbled. The more he learned, the more he realized that his return to their lives couldn't be about punishment or proving a point. It had to be about something bigger, something that might heal old wounds for all of them, even if that healing came with its own kind of pain. 3 weeks after purchasing their house, Marcus was ready for the confrontation that would change all of their lives forever. The morning of the foreclosure, Margaret Wilson stood in her kitchen for the last time, running her fingers along the countertop where Marcus had once sat doing homework while she cooked dinner. Every surface held memories she wasn't ready to release, but the bank had made the timeline clear. They had until noon to vacate the premises. Emma had taken the day off from classes to help with the move. At 20, she was beautiful in the way Margaret had been at that age, with Robert's steady demeanor and a kindness that reminded Margaret painfully of another child who had once filled this house with joy. "Mom, the movers are here," Emma called from the living room. "They need to know which boxes go to the storage unit and which ones go to Aunt Linda's." Margaret took a deep breath and walked into the living room, where boxes containing 30 years of married life sat stacked and labeled. Robert was signing papers with the moving crew, his jaw tight with the humiliation of losing everything they'd worked to build. That's when they heard the car pull up outside. Through the front window, Margaret watched a black BMW park at the curb. The car was expensive, pristine, completely out of place in their struggling neighborhood. When the driver stepped out, Margaret's legs nearly gave way beneath her. She would have recognized him anywhere. The same thoughtful eyes, the same careful way of moving, the same presence that had once filled their home with warmth. But the boy was gone, replaced by a man in an expensive suit, who carried himself with the confidence of someone who had conquered the world that had once rejected him. "Robert," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Robert, come here." Her husband looked up from his paperwork, followed her gaze to the window, and dropped his pen. "My God," he breathed. "Is that Marcus?" Emma said from behind them, and Margaret realized her daughter had been watching too. Emma had been only 2 when Marcus left their lives, but she'd grown up with his pictures on the walls, his story woven into their family history as the big brother who had loved her first. Marcus stood beside his car for a long moment, studying the house, and Margaret wondered what he was thinking. Did he remember the Halloween when they'd all dressed as superheroes, with Marcus as Superman? Did he remember the Christmas morning when he'd insisted on waiting for Emma to wake up before opening presents, even though she was only 6 months old? Then Marcus began walking toward the house, and Margaret felt 21 years of guilt and regret rise in her throat like bile. Robert met him at the door. The 2 men stood facing each other. The boy who had once called him dad, and the man who had failed to protect him when it mattered most. "Hello, Robert," Marcus said calmly. "Margaret, Emma." Emma stepped forward, her young face bright with curiosity and something that might have been hope. "I remember you," she said, "from the pictures. You're my brother Marcus." Marcus's composed expression flickered for just a moment. "Hello, Emma, you've grown up beautiful." The moving crew stood awkwardly in the background, boxes half loaded, clearly sensing they'd walked into a family drama they didn't understand.
"What are you doing here?"
Robert asked, and Margaret heard the defensiveness in his voice, the guilt he'd carried for over 2 decades making him sound harsher than he'd intended. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. "I came to give you something." He handed the envelope to Margaret, who opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a deed to 2047 Maple Street, with her and Robert's names listed as the new owners. No mortgage, no liens, no conditions. The house was theirs, free and clear. Margaret stared at the papers, unable to process what she was seeing. "I don't understand. I bought the house from the bank 3 weeks ago," Marcus said. "I'm signing it over to you and Robert. It's yours." "Why?" Robert's voice broke on the single word. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 21 years of pain and forgiveness. "Because this was my home once. Because Emma deserves to finish growing up in the place where she belongs. Because you taught me that families don't give up on each other, even when everything falls apart." Margaret began to cry then, silent tears streaming down her face. "Marcus, we don't deserve this. What we did to you, how we abandoned you when you needed us most." "You gave me 6 years of being loved," Marcus said quietly. 6 years of knowing what home felt like. Yes, it ended badly. Yes, it broke my heart in ways I'm still healing from. But it also gave me something to build toward. A picture of what family could be when I was ready to create my own. He looked around the living room, at the walls where his artwork had once hung, at the staircase he'd run up every night to brush his teeth and say his prayers. "I need you to understand something," Marcus continued. "I'm not doing this to make you feel better about what happened. I'm not doing it because I forgive you, because forgiveness is more complicated than a single gesture. I'm doing it because Emma shouldn't suffer for choices that were made before she was old enough to understand them. I'm doing it because this house deserves to hold happiness again." Robert was crying openly now, his shoulders shaking with 21 years of suppressed grief. "I'm sorry," he said. "God, Marcus, I'm so sorry. There hasn't been a day I haven't regretted what we did. Not a single day." "I know," Marcus said simply. "I can see it in how you look at me. I could see it even when I was 12 years old." Emma, who had been listening with wide eyes, stepped closer to Marcus. Will you come for dinner sometime? I'd like to know my brother." Marcus looked at this young woman, who shared no blood with him but who had been part of his heart since the day she was born. "I'd like that too," he said, "but we need to take this slowly. There's a lot of hurt to work through, a lot of history to untangle." Margaret found her voice finally. "Marcus, how can we ever repay you for this?" "You can't," Marcus said, and there was no cruelty in his voice, just honesty. "That's not why I did it. I did it because I needed to close this circle for myself. I did it because carrying anger was harder than choosing grace. I did it because this house taught me what love looks like, even if that love wasn't strong enough to keep us together." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "The adoption papers you never finished? They're in a box in my closet. I kept them all these years, not because I was waiting for you to complete them, but because they reminded me that some kinds of belonging can't be made legal. They have to be chosen, every day, by everyone involved." As Marcus walked back to his car, Margaret called after him. "Will we see you again?" He turned around, and for the first time since arriving, he smiled. It wasn't the open, trusting smile of the 7-year-old boy who had once lived in their yellow bedroom, but it wasn't closed off either. It was the careful smile of a man who had learned that healing doesn't erase scars, but it can transform them into something meaningful. "Yes," he said, "you'll see me again." In the weeks that followed Marcus's unexpected gift, the Wilson family found themselves navigating uncharted territory. The house they'd thought they'd lost forever was theirs again, but the emotional landscape had shifted in ways none of them fully understood yet. Margaret walked through the rooms differently now, seeing them through Marcus's eyes. The yellow bedroom that had been his was now Emma's art studio, filled with canvases and paintbrushes, and the creative energy of a young woman finding her voice. But Margaret could still see the ghost of a 7-year-old boy arranging books on a shelf, could still hear the echo of "Goodnight, Mom" called from the top of the stairs. Robert reopened the hardware store, but this time with a different approach. Instead of trying to compete with the big box retailers, he focused on personal service, custom solutions, and building relationships with local contractors. Marcus had quietly arranged for a business loan with favorable terms, though he'd made it clear the gift of the house came with no strings attached. Emma threw herself into getting to know the brother she'd lost before she could remember him. She researched his business, read articles about his success, and peppered her parents with questions about their early years together. But she also began to understand the complexity of what had happened, the way love and fear and practical concerns had tangled together to create an impossible situation. The first dinner invitation came 6 weeks after the house exchange. Emma had been texting Marcus sporadically, sending him pictures of her artwork, updates about her college plans, small attempts to build a bridge across 21 years of separation. When she finally worked up the courage to invite him for Sunday dinner, she spent 3 days planning the menu and cleaning the house. Marcus arrived precisely at 6 o'clock, carrying flowers for Margaret and a bottle of wine for Robert. He looked around the familiar dining room, noting what had changed and what remained the same. The same oak table where they'd shared thousands of meals, but different chairs, different place settings, different family photos on the walls. The conversation was stilted at first, careful and polite. They talked about Emma's college plans, Robert's business, Margaret's volunteer work at the church. Safe subjects that didn't require anyone to venture into the emotional minefield of their shared history. But as the meal progressed, something began to shift. Emma asked Marcus about his work, and he found himself talking about the satisfaction of helping young families buy their first homes, the way financial security could transform someone's entire future. Robert mentioned a problem he was having with the store's inventory system, and Marcus suggested a software solution that could streamline operations. Margaret watched her biological daughter and her former foster son discover they shared a love of art, both of them animated as they discussed color theory and composition. She saw Robert's face light up when Marcus asked about the model rocket collection they'd built together, most of which was still stored in the garage. It wasn't the easy reunion of a family that had never been broken. It was something more complex, and perhaps more meaningful, the careful reconstruction of relationships that had been damaged but not destroyed, the slow work of building trust where it had been shattered. As Marcus prepared to leave that evening, Emma hugged him goodbye with the unself-conscious affection of a 20-year-old who had decided to love her brother regardless of the complicated history she didn't fully understand.
"Thank you," she whispered, "for giving us our house back, for giving me a chance to know you."
Marcus held her carefully, remembering the toddler who had once fallen asleep in his arms while he read her bedtime stories. "Thank you for wanting to know me," he said. "That means more than you realize." Margaret and Robert walked him to the door, and for a moment the three adults stood in the same entryway where they'd said goodbye 21 years earlier. But this time, no one was carrying suitcases. No one was being sent away. "Marcus," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion, "I need you to know that losing you was the biggest mistake of our lives. Not just because of what it did to you, but because of what it did to us. We lost our son, and we lost the people we thought we were." Marcus nodded slowly. "I know you loved me," he said. "I know you thought you were doing what was best for everyone. I also know that love isn't always enough to overcome fear, or circumstances, or the pressure to make impossible choices." "Can you forgive us?" Robert asked. The question he'd been carrying for 2 decades finally spoken aloud. Marcus considered the question carefully. "I can understand you," he said finally. "I can choose to build something new with you, if you're willing to do the work. Forgiveness, that's a process, not a single moment. But I'm willing to try." Over the following months, they began the slow work of rebuilding their relationship. Marcus came for dinner once a month, then twice a month, then whenever his schedule allowed. He helped Emma with her college applications, sharing his own experiences, navigating higher education as someone without family financial support. He advised Robert on business decisions, drawing on his expertise in finance and his understanding of small-town economics. But the real healing happened in the quiet moments. The afternoon Marcus found Robert in the garage, still working on model rockets at 73 years old, and they spent 3 hours building a new design together without talking about the past. The evening Margaret showed Marcus the photo albums she'd kept of his time with them, every school picture and birthday party and family vacation carefully preserved, and he realized she'd been mourning the loss of him for 21 years. The breakthrough came during Emma's high school graduation. Marcus had been invited to the ceremony, but he'd hesitated, unsure if his presence would be appropriate or welcome. Emma had insisted, and so he found himself sitting in the school auditorium, watching his little sister receive her diploma. When Emma crossed the stage, she paused at the microphone. "I want to thank my family," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. "My parents, who taught me that love means making hard choices and living with the consequences, and my brother Marcus, who taught me that grace means choosing love, even when it's difficult." In that moment, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since he was 12 years old. The simple, uncomplicated joy of belonging to a family. Not because of legal papers or blood relations, but because of the choice to keep showing up, to keep trying, to keep believing that broken things could be mended if everyone was willing to do the work. After the ceremony, as they stood together in the school parking lot, Margaret took Marcus's hand. "I have something for you," she said, reaching into her purse. She pulled out a small wrapped package, the same one Miss Henderson had given him before college, which he'd eventually opened during a particularly difficult period in his 20s. "Emma told me you kept our family photos," Margaret said. "I wanted you to have this." Marcus unwrapped the package to find a small silver frame containing a photo he'd never seen before. It showed him at age 9, fast asleep on the living room couch, with 2-year-old Emma curled up on his chest, both of them napping in a patch of afternoon sunlight. "I took this the day before Emma's 2nd birthday," Margaret said softly. "You'd been playing with her all morning, and you both fell asleep, watching cartoons. I looked at you two together, and I thought about how lucky we were to have you in our lives. I thought about how much you loved her, how much she loved you, how perfect our family felt in that moment." Marcus stared at the photo, remembering that day, remembering the weight of his baby sister in his arms, and the complete security he'd felt in that house, in that life. "I kept it separate from the other photos," Margaret continued, "because after you left, it hurt too much to look at. But I could never throw it away because it was proof that we had been a real family, even if we weren't strong enough to stay together." "We're still a family," Emma said, stepping closer to Marcus. "We're just a different kind of family now, one that's chosen to love each other despite everything that went wrong." Marcus looked at the 3 people who had given him his first taste of belonging, who had broken his heart, and who were now offering him a chance at healing. The 12-year-old inside him, the one who had packed his belongings and left this life behind, finally felt safe enough to come home. 2 years later, Marcus stood in the backyard of 2047 Maple Street, watching Emma pack her car for her first semester at State University. She'd received a partial scholarship, and Marcus had quietly arranged for the remaining expenses to be covered through a foundation he'd established for former foster children pursuing higher education. Robert emerged from the garage carrying a box of Emma's childhood belongings, moving slowly but steadily. At 75, he was still working at the hardware store 3 days a week, still building model rockets, still carrying the weight of choices made decades earlier but no longer crushed by them. Margaret came out of the house with a cooler full of Emma's favorite snacks for the drive, her face bright with pride and shadowed with the bittersweet sadness of watching her daughter leave home. She'd aged gracefully into her role as a grandmother figure to the children in their neighborhood, having learned that love multiplies when it's shared freely rather than hoarded carefully. "Are you sure you have everything?" Margaret asked Emma for the 5th time that morning. Emma laughed, the sound carrying across the yard like music. "I have everything I need, Mom. And if I forget something, I can always come home." The word home still carried special weight in their family. They'd all learned that home wasn't just a place or a set of legal documents, but a commitment to keep choosing each other, even when it was difficult, even when it required forgiveness, even when it meant admitting mistakes and working to repair the damage they'd caused. Marcus had his own apartment in the city, his own successful business, his own life that he'd built from the ground up. But he also had a key to the house on Maple Street, a place at the Sunday dinner table, and a family that had learned to love imperfectly but persistently. As Emma drove away to begin her college adventure, Marcus stood with Margaret and Robert on the front porch, watching her car disappear around the corner. The same porch where they'd said goodbye 23 years earlier, where a 12-year-old boy had learned that love could be conditional and temporary. "She'll be fine," Margaret said, though her voice carried a mother's worry. "She'll be better than fine," Marcus replied. "She knows she's loved, and she knows she belongs somewhere." That's more than a lot of people have. Robert placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, a gesture that had taken years to feel natural again. "We never thanked you properly," he said. "Not just for the house, but for giving us a second chance, for teaching us that families can be rebuilt, even after they've been broken." Marcus looked at the man who had been his father for 6 years, who had failed him when it mattered most, and who had spent the last 2 years learning to be the parent he should have been from the beginning. "We all gave each other a second chance," he said. "That's what families do." As the sun set over Cedarville, Marcus drove back to his life in the city, but he carried with him the knowledge that he would always have a home on Maple Street. Not because of the deed with his name on it, not because of the blood ties that had never existed, but because of the daily choice to keep loving each other despite their imperfections. The story of Marcus Johnson and the Wilson family wasn't a fairy tale about perfect forgiveness or miraculous healing. It was something more complex and more real, a story about the hard work of rebuilding trust, the courage required to face past mistakes, and the transformative power of choosing grace over revenge. In the end, Marcus had learned that home wasn't something you found or something you were given. Home was something you created, day by day, choice by choice, with the people who were willing to show up and do the work of loving each other through all the messy, complicated, beautiful challenges of being human. The boy who had been forgotten had grown into a man who chose to remember. The family that had been broken had found a way to be whole again, not by pretending the fractures had never happened, but by learning to see the cracks as places where new light could enter. And in that small house on Maple Street, love continued to grow in all its imperfect, resilient, transformative glory. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is choose to love someone despite everything that went wrong, and trust that they'll choose to love you back. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give is the chance to come home again. This story reminds us that family isn't always about blood or legal documents. Sometimes it's about the courage to love imperfectly, the strength to forgive gradually, and the wisdom to know that home is something we build together, one choice at a time. What does home mean to you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that explore the depths of human connection and the power of second chances.